The first thing I'm going to do before we start is something I neglected to do before, which is for the historical record on here to say what we're doing here. So this is the second session of an interview with Bishop Kevin Boland, who's the current bishop of the Savannah Diocese. Today is Friday, August the 5th, 2011, and it's 10 in the morning. We are in his study at the diocese office in Savannah on East Liberty Street, and I'm the interviewer. My name is Robin Wright Gunn. Our first session was held 1 week ago, 1 week and 1 day ago, which was August the 28th in the same location. So,
and should read, I'm the Bishop Emeritus.
Yes, he is the Bishop Emeritus.
As of July 19th.
Got it, when that was the official point. And then, all right, so we have this transitionary time here.
Right.
Indeed. So my first question for you has to do with our last session. So I just was curious if you had any further thoughts on what we talked about last time before we proceed into some other things, which will lead out of that as well.
Not really. I in some ways I've forgotten what we talked about the last time, and I thought of lots of stuff that I could keep talking and talking and talking.
Well, we'll probably hit on some of those things as we proceed. So, alrighty then. Well, I'm going to ask you some questions, a little bit about the present and a little bit about the past, and then I was thinking, since we have talked about having another session, that in our third session we'll talk about the future. How's that sound? We'll probably get to that. All right, so the first thing I wanted to ask you about this morning is the concept of the Christian mission. A couple of pieces of information, questions about that. The first is that the Savannah Diocese is a mission diocese, and so what the implications have been for your tenure as bishop, how you lead all the different congregations, and then also I'm curious about how technology plays a role in mission, specifically in your tenure, since my observation is that in the 15 years that you've been bishop, we've had probably as rapid technological change in terms of communication mechanisms as we've ever had. So, how's that for a little starter? Let's start with the first one.
We'll start off, first of all, the concept of a mission diocese is like a mission parish. It can be misleading in a way to go back. The meaning of the word mission in its purest sense is to be sent. So a missionary is someone who is sent someplace else to bring the word of God, to proclaim the faith, to nourish the faith. When you talk about a mission diocese, you're talking about maybe a diocese that there would be various benchmarks. Maybe it does not have self-sufficiency of resources to do all that it would like to do. So it gets resources from other areas, that people give us resources to help us do things that we otherwise could not do. So in that sense, you would consider the Diocese of Savannah a mission diocese, because the number of Catholics is relatively small compared to the total population. We perhaps represent maybe 3% of the total population, which can be a little misunderstood in a way, because if people have lived in the city of Savannah all their life, they know there's more than 3% Catholic, and that's true. I've always estimated, it's strictly an estimate, that maybe 10% of Savannah is Catholic, and it's a very well accepted expression of faith in the city of Savannah, and has always been culturally, politically, so on and so forth, been part of the major scene. But once you go out of Savannah and taking into consideration that places like Augusta, Macon, Columbus, Albany, Valdosta, the urban areas are pretty well established, especially Macon and Augusta, more so maybe than the others. Albany would also be in there. But then when you go to small town rural Georgia, you're dealing with handfuls of Catholics. We might have churches where there's 50 families, and it might be a mission church, and so the percentage, that's what brings the overall picture down to 3%.
So what are you doing, what have you been doing as the bishop to, I would say that you're right, as a recent Catholic who grew up here, you know, lots of people that I knew were Catholic. It was just something else to be, like,
Right.
you know, Baptist or Methodist or whatever. So how have you tried to address that perception among the Catholic community in Savannah that, you know, it's a little bit more difficult in the outlying areas?
Well, it happens in various ways. I think the first time we met and we talked about the Gartland Award,
Yes.
where the whole diocese has representatives here at the cathedral, and that's very good for the people from outside coming in. There are people in our diocese, Catholics, who've never seen our cathedral. Never. They know about it and all of that, and they've supported it, and they were very supportive when it had to be restored and renovated, and they gave their nickels and dimes like anyone else to help it happen. When we have the Silver and Gold and Jubilee marriage celebrations, that brings the people together. When we publicize, this is an interesting, when we publicize the changes that say took place in July the 1st of this year, where various priests were going, then they see that one is going to Moultrie, one is going to Americas, one is going to Willacoochee or Douglas or something. You know, in their mindset they say, wow, you know, he's been here with us for 5 years and now he's been, or like Father Mark Van Alstein, who was a little over a year, I think, at the cathedral, 2 at the most, and I made him pastor of Thomasville, Georgia. I went there last week to install him officially as the pastor. Well, that's 240 miles away.
It's a long drive.
It's a long drive.
It's almost a suburb of Tallahassee.
That it is. It's much. It's correct. Very much so. And
Yes.
that's a very graphic one, you know.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
so he recognizes immediately, you know, that the Catholics there are refreshing and good in their own way as they are in the cathedral. And I can foresee, and his predecessors have seen it, that by building up the Catholic community there, you do an awful lot, if you do it properly, of finding acceptance on a level where once there would have been resistance or resentment or maybe prejudice against Catholics.
I've been reading in this history of the diocese, and last night I was reading about the Watsonites, and that was just an incredible thing to read to me.
Right.
And the law that was passed in the state legislature requiring inspections of all the convents,
right, yeah.
and just it was incredible. I've been aware of some basic, you know, just sort of suspicion of Catholicism that is pervasive, but you know, I never really understood that it was at the same time as Jim Crow, and that basically blacks, Jews, and Catholics were all lumped together as the enemy in a legislative act. It was just astonishing to me.
So can you imagine what you would be if you were a black Catholic?
Oh my heavens!
You'd have a double whammy, you know.
Incredible, just incredible.
And that's why we have a history in some of our, under, I guess, Archbishop O'Hara maybe, where we had schools exclusively for blacks, even though most of them were not Catholic, because it was a mission of the church to give good education to these people to whom it was not available at that time, you know. And they were when I first came to, I find that kind of unique in a way. When I first came to Savannah in 1959, segregation was still in place.
Right.
You know, it was the early 60s. And the whole thing was new to me because I'd never experienced like that divisiveness, you know. It was just not in my mindset. And it took me a long time to understand it and the whys and the wherefores of it, you know. Not because I kind of had a more glorious kind of personality or anything like that. And plus I was brought up in Ireland where we seldom, if ever, saw black people.
Right.
So my own culture upbringing was kind of completely white in that sense. But then to come to, so when the riots broke out and the protests broke out, and that was just mind-boggling to me.
How old were you when you came? I know it's in here, but
24.
wow.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.
So I will say that one of the things I thought was curious in here, and perhaps I didn't look carefully, but I didn't see anything about St. Pius X High School in here.
Oh,
And
yeah.
that was a fairly important formative experience for a lot of African Americans that are very successful today.
Right.
And they have a very loyal alumni group, and I'm curious as to your experience with St. Pius X and just your general reflections on it.
Well, again, Pius X was a high school model of
Mhm.
what we had in 3 different grade schools that were all African American. And Pius X was relatively new. It was a kind of I'd have to go back and see when it was founded, but it was way after the grade school. But it was an effort, I would say, on behalf of the diocese and the African American community. Well, we bring them so far up to grade school, but we're not supplying high school education. And that led to the founding of Pius X, which was also staffed in those days by SMA priests, Society of African Missions, and by the same Franciscan sisters. And what happened to it is, in a way, what happened to the other schools, with the coming of integration, it became much more difficult to sustain the school. Even though efforts were made to have what we call like integration the other way, to get some white families to go to Pius X, because it was run by the diocese, whereas Benedictine and St. Vincent's are both what we call private schools. They don't come under the bishop's jurisdiction. They come under the jurisdiction of the religious communities that run them, with the guarantee, of course, that they teach the Catholic faith authentically and so on and so forth. The effort, I would say, to integrate Pius X was only minimally successful. We got some white families to go there, but I guess there were so few, it was quite obvious that, that it probably wouldn't work if I guess we did make the point it was open to everyone, if you know what I mean. That was no longer its founding was founded on the segregation principle, I would say, and
that makes sense. Yeah.
And then integration came, and in time it just did not become sustainable.
Now, were black students beginning to go to St. Vincent's and to BC at that point?
There were, yes. Yeah.
So that would cause
So
that too. Yeah.
And you could say, I know that both schools were very, very active in reaching out to black students. And I would say that St. Vincent's certainly had substantial numbers that I can remember over the years and still have today. Benedictine, I'm not sure of the numbers. Since I live downtown, I was much more conscious of seeing the student body. But Benedictine is, obviously both schools today are wide open to integration. There's no problems there. But the percentage of, that's something the percentage of black Catholics compared with white Catholics is very small.
So back to my sort of original question, if you will, about mission.
Mission, yeah.
And, in the Protestant world, we talk about that sometimes as evangelism, is what we call that, spreading the gospel. And so I would be curious about 2 things. One is the technology question that I asked you, and sort of a related question is the Catholics Come Home campaign, if you will, that I've seen some of the efforts for.
Okay. I want to go back to mission for a while. What you say in the Protestant sense or non-Catholic sense, we also have that, like the mission of the church is to bring Christ to everyone. That
to bring the good news.
To bring the good news. That's, if you want to say that, what's the basic purpose of the church, of the Catholic faith? It is to bring it to its people, So mission can be also used in that sense. We'll also use it in the sense that we've a parish and it's got a mission. In that sense, we mean it does not have a resident pastor. It's serviced out of the mother church, as it were.
Got it.
So we've 58 parishes and 24 missions or something, So it's a kind of a loose word in that sense. Technology. Technology is changing the face of the earth, and we've got to be there with it, And as a diocese, during my time, of course, and I'm one who has been dragged into it because I was never part of it when I grew up, and sometimes I regret it very much, because I have to learn it like a child learning to speak in a way. So the fact that I can do email and a couple of things like that now, that's wonderment to me. It's still a wonderment when I press a button, and that conversation that I've is gone 1,000 miles in a flat. I don't understand it.
It's a mystery.
It's mind-boggling.
Yes.
So on the diocesan level, like we do, like out of this office, the very fact that if I want to, I can write a letter to every priest in the diocese with the press of a button right now. So instead of mailing a lot of stuff, we're now doing email and websites, and we even do conferences by telephone now. When I have a personnel meeting, which would be maybe a couple of times a year when I meet with 4 or 5 priests, to discuss the possibility, will we do this or do this, or should I ask Father so-and-so to go here, and that type of thing. Quite frequently, rather than have them travel 100 miles to have maybe a 2-hour meeting, we'll do it by conference call. And I can see us getting to the stage where we'll do webcams and that type of thing. And I've used Skype once or twice.
Oh, there you go.
But again,
I haven't done that yet.
I must write it down I have the camera in here, but I never get around to using it that much. Right?
Well, so in my RCIA class, there was one family who is traditionally Pentecostal, and they all, a husband and wife and their adult daughter, and they first became exposed to Catholicism as a result of the daughter watching EWTN. And she became curious about it and started going to Lady of Lourdes. Is that the church in Port Wentworth? And then got her parents, they were so curious about what she was doing, and the next thing you know, they're all in my RCIA class. So I just thought that was a very interesting story. That, because how many times have I zapped past that on the channel and spent 15 to 20 seconds and then moved on. Now I don't have cable now, so it's been a while since I've seen EWTN, but I thought, well gosh, there's an example of some, technology doing, a new way to spread the good news. And then I saw the videos of some of the Catholic Come Home materials, and then I saw some of the spots on television. Right. So can you talk a little bit about what the motivation for the Catholics Come Home was from your point of view? Because I'm guessing it was an optional thing. The diocese didn't have to do it if we didn't want to.
Right. It certainly was an optional thing, and we decided to do it because, well, personally I had read about the success on Phoenix, Arizona, where it was first put on, and they were claiming something like 50,000 people had returned to the faith. And whether that's true or not true, I don't know. I've since talked to the Bishop of Phoenix, and like all statistics, you can do lots of things with them. Of the 50,000, a lot of people had never registered before or something. They decided to register, but they were practicing and so on. But at the same time, a lot of people had come back. Now, the reason you could say that we decided to do it as a diocese, and then we got Atlanta to go with us, so we had a kind of common purpose for the whole state, which became important when we were buying television time in the various stations, because we would be going into the same markets and we'd be sharing the cost and that. But it was the use of something that 99% of our people are looking at for many hours every day, and can we be in there with ads that are highly, highly professionally done and give the right message of what Catholicism is all about, and extend an invitation to a generation of people, many of whom have left just out of carelessness, or they were not brought up in the faith, or they had some unfortunate incident with a priest or a nun or one of their fellow friends or something, and they just left the church. And it was an outreach in a very professional, technological type of way, where you could meet thousands of people rather than sitting at your desk and waiting for the phone to ring. And what we wanted to do was let the phones ring by people who were making inquiries as a result of this kind of highly concentrated and powerful television commercials. They were really, and I would say that they were very, very well done, and it did bring a lot of people and renewed faith. Now some of the parishes, not all of them, but some of them are continuing the concept of Catholics come home by having a very kind of I have one in mind where the foyer is very obviously, when you walk into the foyer of the place of worship, there's pamphlets there about welcome home, and which you can pick up and read. And sometimes we've run stories in our own newspaper, a profile of someone who's come home, and they kind of tell briefly what their story is. And we think this will snowball effect. Catholics have never been good at being evangelizers, the persons in the pew. Regretfully, they've kind of left it to the priest. That's their job. You know. They do the Mass, they do the sacraments. But unlike Baptists, I wish we had some of their verve, where if you moved into Moultrie, Georgia, and they know you're next door, they'll come knocking at your door and want to know what church you belong to.
And invite you to come to church.
Invite you to come to church. We would never dream of doing that, you know. Now we have now people talking to their friends who they know are Catholic and of not practicing. That is happening much more so than it used to. So in the long run, I think it will kind of change the image of what it means to be a Catholic, that we must be more out front with it, we must be more proud of it. As I'll often tell, like young people I'm confirming, I'll always usually use the phrase, always be proud of your faith. There's no need to apologize for it. And because they're up against it by being questioning, well, why do you still worship saints, and why do you do this, and you don't have to tell your sins to a priest, and so on and so forth. And we've got to train these people, teach them how to answer those questions, but also to turn it around in a positive way. Why I am enriched by being a Catholic, and the presence of Christ in my life, the presence of Christ in the sacraments, that we begin to talk about that, that it's not something that exclusively belongs to me and I don't tell anyone about it, type of thing.
I have had to answer the question of why about my Catholicism so often from so many people that, and it's just not a simple answer, and it's often, you know, like standing in line at the grocery store or something. It's like, really? You want to know now? So, I mean, it's a long, thing, but yes, it's a difficult question. It's a challenging question to answer without it being, people are just genuinely curious, both non-Catholics and Catholics, especially people who were born into the faith. They sort of have not had that call experience, I guess, that, a lot of them have sort of it seems like they're having it sort of a resurgence of that.
Right, regurgitated. Yeah.
Well, it's like, now they're not taking it as just part of what they did. It's like now they're choosing to continue to participate, it seems like. Yeah. And I was going to ask you about something about that. And I was going to tell you this, that I ran into some cradle Catholic friends of mine, a mom and a son, outside of the cathedral when I was at Mass there about a month after Easter. And I said, hi. And we were all sort of surprised to see each other there because they knew I was Presbyterian. And this was 2 years ago. And they said, well, we came to Mass on Easter, and Bishop Boland asked us all in the congregation to consider coming back to church 6 more times. They said, he didn't say come every week. They said 6 times. And he said, and they thought, this is something we can do. And so there they were for their first of their 6 visits. So I want you to know it worked.
I'm glad you told me that.
I mean, really.
Yeah.
It was, and they were just stunned by sort of the whole, wow, really? They're willing, the bishop is willing to let us only come 6 times, and they seem to be really looking forward to it. So there you go.
Yeah, but see, that was Christmas and Easter. We've never come to terms with Christmas. There's so many people there. Like you look at Christmas, and in the trade, when I say that clerically, we will say, the poinsettias are all here at Mass. They've come to see the red poinsettias or the poinsettia tree. So you can say that maybe 2/3 of the people there are there just for that one time. And it's very, very difficult because you don't want to dishonor the people who come all year round, and to make Christmas a really spirit-filled occasion. But I've always tried to reach out to those who are there for that one time and say, just like I did at Easter. So it hit that one family anyway.
Yeah, and I'm sure it hit others too.
And my methodology there is, if they come for 6 times, they're going to come again.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so rather than saying you must come to Mass every Sunday, that's what Catholics do.
It's a lot of pressure.
It's a lot of pressure, so you've got to ease them back into it.
Yes, and I, having worked in the Presbyterian Church, I was on staff at First Presbyterian for about a year, and it's the whole thing of, do they know about any other parts of the Bible other than the birth and the crucifixion? Because these are people that only come at those times, and so they don't hear the rest of it, which is sort of how you got from one to the other. And so it's just an interesting thing. So do you feel like it's working? You do feel like the Catholics Come Home is working?
Yes, I do. I think it was a big investment of money. I forget what it was, $60,000 or $70,000. Some of which was the excess of our annual bishop's appeal that we do.
Right.
So we decided to put it into that. I think it is worse, and we can't stop there. We may not have Catholics Come Home again, but we can have some variation of it. That the mission of the church always is to be looking for the lost sheep of Israel.
Right.
That's going to be a continuum. There's never a stage in the life of a parish or the life of a diocese where you can say, well, the job is done, we can sit back now, and the stock market's at its highest and we can't do anything else. We're dealing with the lives of people, which are a continuum. They're born, they're teenagers, they get married, and there's all sorts of trends of what's happening in that life out there. And what I call the dynamic or the breathing apparatus of the church must be addressing all of these things in all sorts of different ways.
So what about evangelism to the Catholics that are already home?
Already home? Well,
there's a lot of people there that just like cruise in, get communion, cruise out.
One of the most challenging things in the church today would be adult formation in the faith for the cruisers, if you want to call it. Because they figure they're going to Mass on Sunday, they get communion, bingo. And it's very, very unfortunate. Whether we as an institution are to blame for that, I don't know. But we must recognize the fact that so many Catholics have the basics, or just the basics, but they've never enriched their faith by looking at the broader picture of what the church is and how it does its work, and so on and so forth.
And then how about the unchurched, the non-Catholics come home?
They're out there. That's what programs like the RCIA and other programs like that are. And the RCIA is, in my time in the church, when I was ordained a priest, my first 10 years, remember, all my instructions were one-on-one. You would come to see me and I'd see you once a week for maybe 20 weeks and then receive you into the church. And I might have 3 or 4 other people doing the same thing. And on analysis, it was very good. You got very personal care and all that type of thing, and the one-on-one basis. And it was usually just the priest, the lay people were not involved. The RCIA, to me, is a much broader and expansive introduction with a group of people there who are all on the same journey but on different buses, if you know what I mean. Different vehicles are bringing them on this journey. Plus you have the priest, and you might have a lay catechist, and you might have a deacon, you might have a seminarian, and it's much more enriching. And then this rite of election, which I think I talked about at the last thing.
That was so good. That was great.
It's the official stamp again. It's the community aspect of the church that we must constantly emphasize, because that will draw the loners ultimately in, or the cruisers, as you call them, very good. The cruisers are not part of the community at times. They're very good people, but they're kind of very narrow in their approach to the church. So the RCIA has been a great blessing for the church. And it was a return to what the early church was like, when people gathered together around the table of the Lord Many of them were not breaking bread yet or taking the Eucharist because they'd not been baptized or brought into the faith. And so...
In our RCIA group, all of the sponsors either said directly or implied that it was as meaningful and important of a learning experience for them. They seemed to be getting as much of it out of it as we were.
Correct.
It was really something to see.
Yeah. Which is not
it really helped me feel like I was helping them too.
Right,
you know.
Which is another advantage. You put words into my mouth. The RCIA. If there is the best adult formation we have in our class, actually, are the sponsors in our RCIA program. They're marvelous, and they are being enriched. What they said to you is, they see a wider aspect of the church than, say, they got in the Penny Catechism. Who is God? God. Who made the world? God made the world. Who is God the Son? Who is God the Holy Ghost? And they had kind of clipped answers, but there was never any fleshing out of what it is we believe and who the Lord Jesus is, and how he can be very much an integral part of our life.
So now I'm going to ask you some hard questions. Okay. So I want to ask you about how you handled some of the more challenging times within the church, whether within the Savannah Diocese or on a national or international level. And I'm just going to throw out a few things. And I'm curious from an administrative point of view, from a pastoral point of view, how did you help your parishioners or your people? And then how did you handle it personally from a spiritual point of view? And I'm going to start with some of the things. I know you lost several friends, Father Chidi and Father Gerardo very recently, and there was also a religious who was murdered during your time, and I believe one other priest that passed away that you were very close to. So tell me about those.
Well, with regard to the priest dying, maybe the other priest is Monsignor Burke.
Yes.
Who was a good friend of mine, yeah. And Monsignor Burke died in 1998, and I became a bishop in 1995. But Monsignor Burke was 25 years older than I was in the priesthood. He came to the United States in 1934 as a newly ordained priest. I came exactly 25 years after him, and I was the first Irish priest to come since he came. So there was kind of that gap of 25 years, which was now going to be renewed because others would follow me, also from Ireland. And it was a particular slice of the history of Savannah that some scholar will write someday. You know, why these priests came, who they were, what they did, what their impact was, and the fact that one of them became the bishop of the diocese. So Monsignor Burke then retired after I became a bishop. He was in retirement. First of all, he was my first pastor. So my very, if you can imagine, I'm green behind the ears. I'm 24 years of age, going on 25, and I fly into Savannah. I've never been in the United States before in my life. I fly over all the pine trees. I said, good Lord, what is this all about? I get off at the Savannah airport, and I'm wearing a heavy serge coat that I brought from Ireland with me. And the heat is pressing me into the tarmac. I always remember that. It was absolutely oppressive. You know, there was none of those. You had to go down the steps from the plane onto the tarmac. And there was about 10 or 11 priests to meet me, just to greet me. And so that was kind of helpful. But I was basically in a fog, new place, left family, all that type of thing. And so I went up to Monsignor Burke then for 2 years, with the understanding that, like, people of my age group or people they said, God, that's a tough place to start, because he was known as a taskmaster, you know, that he. When I look back on it, he was only 25 years a priest himself at that time. He was a relatively young man in his 50s. But as it were, we got along very, very well. We got along very fine. I never had any problems with him. And part of it was my training in the seminary, which is different from what happens in today's seminaries. And I'm not making a judgment here, just the training was different. I'll always remember the pastoral theology, as we call it. How do you grow into good pastoral practice in a parish of dealing with people on the good days and the bad days, and deaths and funerals, weddings, visitation of the sick, and RCIA or instructions and all that. But I'll also remember Father Bill Purcell saying, for the first 6 months, if not 12 months, depending on the place, he says, you keep your ears open and your mouth shut.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of followed that, you know. I listened and I observed, I listened and I saw, and did not have many opinions about many things, and did what I was told, if you know what I mean,
Mm-hmm.
without question. And so maybe that's why we got along so well. I mean, I was never contesting anything or
Mm-hmm.
saying I didn't or didn't want to do it. But I was only 2 years there, but there were 2 very good years. At that time, I had a great facility of remembering people's names too, and visiting people's homes, and I got to know a lot of their children. And I discovered that if you get to know children, you get to know their parents very quickly, and you get to know your parish and people like that. So, where was all that getting me?
About the people that you were close to,
Oh,
the
close.
deaths of clergy
Oh, the
and
deaths of clergy,
religious,
right.
and how you
So it
handled
was
that.
coming to Monsignor Burke then. So
Mhm.
when I became a bishop then, Monsignor Burke was a blessing to me, because he had been what we call a great missionary. He had been all over this diocese in different appointments, and he would tell me as we would go, say, through Ryan, Georgia, which is over in Route 280 on the way to Albany. He said, I said Mass here 45 years ago in
Wow.
so-and-so's house. And I remember them well, because in those days, quite frequently, we had no churches. They just said Mass in people's homes on a kind of a rotating basis. You know, well, I'll be back next month, and if there's people in your neighborhood, that you invite them and we'll have Mass. And so he's a great connoisseur. He was a great historian. So he kept me enamored,
Mm-hmm.
and I was learning as I went, you know. So then he died quite suddenly in September the 15th, 16th, mid-September of 1998. And it was a monumental. He was an extraordinary man when I think about it. He had been retired for a good number of years. And I doubt if I'll ever see this again. He filled a cathedral. He filled a cathedral with people that he had served as a priest. They came like the children of their parents that he had buried. And he did that up to within a month or two of his death. He was 86 or 87 when he died. But he would still go to funerals. He would still be asked by people to preach at funerals.
Mm-hmm.
And even though I would be much younger than a lot of the other priests, you know, we would have a different approach and all that type of thing. And we would say, God, this is awful stuff, you know what I mean? But he proved us wrong, if you know what I mean, in that sense. That
Mm-hmm.
he knew his people, and they basically loved him, because he never gave up being a priest in his retirement.
Mm-hmm.
Never gave up. Visited the sick all the time. Went to the Legion of Mary. I guess, you know...
So how did you pastor the congregations through that experience?
Well, I pastored them. I guess you could find my homily sometime. I spent a lot of work working in that homily on his humanity and what he did. And when you look at what he did to enrich the diocese and enrich his people, you're dealing with a gift that you give back to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And you've kind of no regrets about it, you know what I mean? There is not sorrow here, because this man died with his boots on, you know.
Yeah.
So what more do you want? It's what you'd want for your best friend, you know. So
Was he your best friend?
he'd be my best friend, and I wouldn't say like on a social Well, he could be. Yeah. He was my best friend as a father figure, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? He was 25 years older than I was. But of course, you get to the stage, you can be 86 and I can be in my 50s, so it's the same thing, if you know what I mean.
It all levels out,
It all
doesn't
levels out once you start gaining, and so in that sense, I've had very good friend priests and some who've left the priesthood and that type of thing. So I find it hard to distinguish between one and the other. But he was a man that grew on me. You know, initially I was kind of afraid of him, and he was very authoritarian and very dogmatic, and but the more I lived with him, and the more I saw what he did, and the more he committed was. He was the type of man who would say, look, that he never had a bad day in the priesthood. It's not many people can say that. You know, it's like someone who says, I've never had a bad day in my marriage. You look at him, wow, you must be something special, you know.
Well, I'd like to ask you about the religious who was murdered and the impact of that on the parish and how you helped them. And do you think you were able to help them? And what were the particulars of that? I don't have the details with me.
Yeah, that was Sister Philomena Fogarty. Well, that was an awful tragedy, awful. She was abducted. She and another nun were both abducted out of their convent and taken up to Virginia. And one of the sisters was able to escape. They were kind of held, and she brought him into a house or something. But one of them had been put in the trunk of the car all for the whole journey up to Virginia. And then I guess we never know whether he actually killed this other nun, but when they found her, she'd been dismembered, and it was just awful. So they brought her back to Christ the King in Pine Mountain, Georgia, for the burial. And they transferred the body then up to her house, I forget where now, where her religious community had their mother house. And you can imagine that parish. This lady, Sister Philomena, she's a former school teacher and nun for that community. But in her time in Christ the King, she was in charge of the social services of the parish and brought lots of the other non-Catholic churches in with her. And they would take care of the poor, food, clothing, medication, visitation. So they became a kind of a little, what would you say, the touch of God in the midst of this, in Harris County, you know, which is north of Columbus County, and Pine Mountain is the biggest. So she was known all over the place, you know, as the kind of the angel of mercy, really. And in her personality-wise, I've discovered people like this have to be very strong in their personality to do what they do, because they run into all sorts. And Sister Philomena was like that. She would be bossy, and she'd tell you, do this, do that, and she'd even be bossy to the priest when he'd go up to say mass there, you know. And so when you got to know her there, you understood her bossiness, you know what I mean, and you went with it. And for anyone to suffer or to finish her life the way she did it's kind of beyond comprehension. And at the funeral was the father of the man who killed her.
Oh my goodness.
Who was highly thought of in the parish. This was his son, who was deranged. And so the sisters insisted that he had to, he wanted to be at the funeral, but he found, of course, very, very difficult. How did I help them? I don't know how I helped them, except, again, I spent, first of all, there was Father Madden was there. He's still there as the priest. He was very, very good with them. And as the pastor, he brought them a lot of solace and help. We had to take the funeral down to Columbus because of the numbers. The church in Pine Mountain would hold about 100 people. So the church, And we brought her down to the church in Columbus, where she used to teach in the school that was attached to St. Anne's, Columbus, and where I used to be pastor myself before I became a bishop. So I knew an awful lot of the people there. Again, I tried to use the gospel story and the readings of that there are certain tragedies we will never understand. There is certain suffering in the world that's beyond us. And why God delivers it to us can only be found in the mystery of the death of Christ himself, that we're participating in that mystery. Even I use that in personal sickness, when people are personally sick, that they can be very enriched by it if they understand that they're participating in the mystery that God himself, in the person of Christ, suffered immensely and unjustly, in the same kind of sense for us. Sister Philomena's family, of course, a number of them, she was born in Ireland, came up in Ireland. So, being Irish myself, I was able to identify with them very easily and very quickly. They actually came from my hometown.
Oh, wow.
Never knew them before this, but I knew where they lived, and we were. So all of that indirectly helped, you know. Yeah.
Now, there are those who might say about a crime like that the perpetrator of such a crime in the United States of America should be punished by death. So how does a defender of the death penalty who's been victimized by such a crime respond to such a suggestion?
Well, in this case, the sisters themselves were very, very adamant. They wanted the man tried, but no death penalty. They did not want a death penalty. And so they were following our present teaching of the church. I saw the phrase, and I've heard it from other people, I saw it used in the paper the other day with regard to a trial for the death penalty. And the phrase is, and it kind of explains it all in a way. Why do we kill people who kill people to prove that killing people is wrong? And from a human point of view, that would be our stance. And I also want to make sure that it's only since the Pope came on a visit, John Paul II came on a visit to St. Louis, Missouri, and it was within the concept of one of his talks in St. Louis that he came out very, very strong and said, we as a church must rid ourselves of the death penalty, because kind of God is the ultimate job and ultimate judge of everything, and the death penalty diminishes the possibility of someone finding forgiveness and reconciliation, and we should let God do his work. But yes, punishment, yes. I've always held, even before I was the official kind of stance of the church in this, that to give someone life imprisonment working for the state is far more significant than killing them. Because the killing of that person does not bring back the life of the person that's killed. It never will. And they claim that it brings closure to the victim's family and that, and maybe, I don't know, I can't answer that. But what is closure? Tragedies like that. I was in Rome when this happened. And I was able to go to the Mother House and say Mass there within a couple of hours after I got the word. And then I flew back from Rome to be here for the funeral. So we have an ongoing case here with MacPhail, the policeman who was killed. And I've met with that family on occasions. Sister Jackie, who was our former social director, was very helpful in helping that the Davis family, I should say, who are, what's his name?
Anthony
Davis, yeah. But you're right. But I must admire the sisters from day one. I didn't even have them to ask them. They just came and told me. They said, "We're going to let the legal process go through,
but the prosecutor wanted to go for the death penalty. And I think they responded by saying, well, we'll be very uncooperative if the death penalty is involved.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, they could be my words rather than
Right.
their words. But they were very, very adamant that they did not want the death penalty. And I sit here and I forget that man is probably still in jail.
I certainly hope that's the case.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask
to give you a question of Norway. There's no death. Most of European countries do not have the death penalty. And it's funny that would claim to be the most advanced country culturally, and we don't have it. We still have the death penalty. And as you know, as I know it, there's a rabid group out there that live and die by the death penalty. So, the Goods, what's the name of the movie? It was very moving. I went to see Dead Man Walking.
Oh yes, she came to Blessed Sacrament and lectured about 10 years ago or so, or maybe less than that, and she was riveting.
Riveting, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there were police officers present at her lecture, and it was packed.
Yeah.
That was well before I ever thought about any, darkening the door of any Catholic church. She definitely helped my faith walk.
I think these are some of the issues in a way that attract people to the church, because we have a very specific stand on life, if you know what I mean.
Oh, yes.
And its sacredness. And, and a lot of it is understood, but when it comes to like contraception and abortion and the death penalty, they all deal with the dignity of the human person, no matter how horrid that human person may be. That to deliberately take their life because of their crimes is kind of saying there's no forgiveness. As Catholics, we'd be all in trouble if there was no forgiveness.
That's for sure. So I'm going to just jump to the other big issue in the church during your time as bishop, and that is, which touched our parish to some degree, and that is the sex abuse scandal in the church as a whole. So your personal responses, how you pastored people, what your administrative role was, how are you dealing with it even now? It doesn't seem to go away.
Yeah. Which parish did you say touched?
St. James.
Oh yes, of course. Long after the priest was gone.
Right.
Yeah. First of all, I'm looking at it now, perspective over whatever I forget when Dallas was when we passed the charter. I forget. I'm terrible in years. They all seem to
that
go
we
by.
can look back up. That's not a big deal.
Right. Because I was a bishop at the time in Dallas when we passed the charter. Number one, it's a terrible tragedy for the church. And when I say it's a terrible tragedy for the church, the tragedy is so many people were hurt, more so than we'll ever understand or comprehend. And the only way we can come to terms with this is, as far as possible, to make sure that we as a church, as an institution, that it will never happen again. I want to put in a preface there. That's an impossible goal, but it's the goal we must reach for. Because human persons commit sins, and human persons do things wrong, whether they be priest or bishop or pope or whatever it may be. But there is certain, as a result of the disclosures that happened and what happened in society in those days, a lot of that we have hopefully rectified and put in place as processes that makes it as difficult as possible for this to happen again. I think as a church and as an institution, we've learned an awful lot about the horrors of the molestation of children. and how damaging it is to them and what a terrible happening it is. But we've also come to terms that, and I hesitate to talk about this because I don't want to kind of take the church off the hook. We must be in there, full blown, more so than any other institution in society, because of what we stand for, which is for the care of people and the care of children and the education of children. Like, this is part of our mission. And when you obviate that mission, then you become a lie, you know. And we cannot be a lie. We must be the truth of who Jesus Christ is. So we must be grounded in that understanding of who we are as church. And so there were times when obviously we were not church. And what have I done administratively is, say in the case of the priest that you were talking about, he's laicized, he'll never minister as a priest again. I did everything possible within my concept of who I was as the bishop to obliterate and make it impossible. Like, it's a strange thing for me to say, you know, the fact that the legal case ultimately imprisoned him was justified. But, and I'm not trying to defend ourselves here, the victims didn't come forward at the time. We did not know about the victimization. And when we did everything possible for it, to take it to, like, for well, as you know, he spent 5 years in jail, and he's been officially laicized by the church. And now you can come back to those hard questions again if you want to. I want to say, since we passed the Charter of the Bishops of the United States, I would claim, and we spent millions of dollars on a special study of which there's a copy available as public.
The one that just came out about a month ago.
Around a month ago, yeah. There's two parts to it. The first is the causes and the context. What caused it and what context it was in. And we found out an awful lot about that, because we opened up to the John Jay College they're the people who did it. We employed them to do it, but with a contract that was completely independent, that they were not beholding to us. We wanted to know the truth. So as an institution, we've gone the extra mile in trying to find out what transpired and what the context and what has happened. And the first part of the study actually was the source and the amount of molestation that took place all over the United States, with every diocese supplying information. And we were able to identify when it peaked, like in the mid-70s, and then floated off. And that study is worth reading in the sense that it gives you an overall picture of it. And grave mistakes were made by the church, grave, brushing it under the carpet. And the strange thing is that, in a sense, our society was doing it too. In other words, we had become so much part of the culture and society in which we lived that we were no different from anyone else when it came to this whole concept of the care of children. But it's night and day where we are today and what we were yesterday. Everyone now, not just here in the Savannah Diocese, we have a full-time office for the protection of children. Every volunteer in our diocese, as far as possible, has to have a background check and has Virtus training, where they are exposed to a 3-hour training program of what to look for when this danger arises now, and to do something about it immediately. Every diocese now has, I have a committee of professionals that guide me. When I get a case, I can present it to them. What should I do with this? How bad is this case? And in the meantime, if I do get a case where there's a credible allegation, for example, I will immediately put the priest on, or if it's an employee, not a priest even, on administrative leave until the whole thing is fully examined. So I have one person in that category right now. Like one priest who's he's like on permanent administrative leave, and from my knowledge, he will not go back on priesthood. But I must protect his church rights and his canonical rights and his civil rights. There's nothing civil against him at the present time. No one has brought an allegation against him civilly. But from my knowledge of the case, there's my knowledge, my individual knowledge, things are not right there, so I don't put him back in the priesthood. In other words, I'll be extra conservative on that side for the benefit of the children.
So there are, in other denominations, in response to just general concerns about sexual impropriety between clergy and lay people, regardless of if they're children or adults. There are policies in place that would, in fact, for example, prohibit us from having this conversation that we're having now because there's not a window in that door.
Correct, right, yeah.
So, I was talking about this with somebody the other day. I took my first confession, and it was just me and the priest in this box that was about as big as this half of the room. The door was open, but, so how does the church respond? Because that's a sacrament. So how does the church respond to, as you said, being a part of the society that we're in and yet maintain the integrity of the sacraments? What are your thoughts on all that?
Well, the integrity of the sacrament confession is still very, very valuable. And in most places now, when we build new confessionals and things like that, they're more like rooms, and there's glass exposure where people can look in. And you're right, perfectly right, all of this building, maybe where we have conference rooms, there should be windows in them, especially if there's children involved, but also for adults, because there can be inappropriate activity between adults. And that, to emphasize the confession though, more and more we've what we call open confession, where the penitent sits in front of the priest or by the priest. When I hear confessions at the cathedral, for example, it's on the wide open, but there's no one within 20 feet of me, they cannot hear what's going on. And the new confessional we built at the cathedral has this frosted glass doors, so it's very protective in that sense.
So do you think, have we gone too far as a society in response to these things? I guess that would be my question, which is perhaps implying my own bias, because sometimes I feel like that's the case.
Yes, I think there's always a danger of overreaction, and I'd say in this case there has been overreaction. I think we're, how has it impacted in the individual priest? Say when I was a young priest, when kids would hug my legs and like children, in the 3rd and 4th grade, who would absolutely love you when you came into the classroom and wanted to kibitz with you and all that type of thing. We're gun shy. We've become gun shy. We're afraid now to put our hand on the top of a child's head and things like that, and I hope it regains balance, you know what I mean? And,
perhaps for now it's necessary because the damages were so great.
So great, correct. Yeah,
people are still so hurt.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for probably maybe one more question, because I know we're getting to the end of the hour. Let's see. Why don't we, since we're sort of talking about nationally difficult times or church-wide, Pope John Paul II died during the time that you were the bishop also, and he was he was just beloved. So how did you pastor people in that experience? And did you know him personally? I'm not really clear on how this all works. I apologize for my ignorance.
It's okay. No. I had know him personally in this sense that I met him very first time I met him, if you want to hear that. I like to tell that story. We went on an ad limina visit every 5 years, a bishop, even though it's more than 5 years now. We're running behind time with the new pope, but remember he's 83 years of age. But I went in ad limina. Ad limina means Limina, to the doors of Rome every 5 years, and
church policy. The bishop goes to Rome and kind of greets the Pope, gives a report on your diocese, and it's kind of going to the doors of Peter and Paul. That's the origins of our church. And so maybe I was ordained 95, so this could have been 98 or 99. I was a couple of years a bishop. And usually a region goes, so all the bishops of Atlanta, Savannah, Charlotte, Raleigh, Charleston, and some of the Florida bishops, there'd be 7 or 8. We would all go over there as a group, so there's maybe about 20 bishops there. And we all get our turn to, there's various things you do. Like in those days, the format was, number one, you could have lunch with the Pope as a group. Then you would meet the Pope individually. And then he would, with another convocatio, where he would greet all 20 of us together and give us a talk or a sermon or greetings, etc. So the story I like that I'll always remember, of course, is the lunch in his private apartment or where he stayed. And the present Pope doesn't do that. Not because he doesn't want to, but I think trying to, when you've hundreds of bishops coming from all over. Anyhow, at the lunch, we're all kind of, there's a certain protocol, I think. The Pope was kind of a rectangular table. The Pope was here, and was two other bishops here and 2 there, 1 at each end of the table, and then 4 or 5 of us at that end. And I was at that corner, and the Pope was over here. And he has, obviously, I was able to notice, he had a list of with the names of who were at the table. And so he started here, and it might have been, like for a name was all caught up in the scandal, from might have been Cardinal Law or Cardinal Regal, a couple of cardinals, and he would chit-chat with them. He would have known those on a much more personal level because they would have been in Rome with much more frequency. Then so he went there, hopped over here, and by the way, next to me was the Pope's secretary bishop. He's the Archbishop of Krakow now, but at that time he was Bishop Javits, was it Polish. So then he went down here, and he would chit-chat with each one of them. And he had this great capacity. He'd say, I'm from Venice, Florida. And then he'd say, yes, but you know so-and-so, and you're not long a diocese, and a couple of anecdotes. So he eventually gets to Kevin Boland. And he says, Bishop Boland, and he says, Savannah. Well, Savannah. And then he says, Pulaski.
Wow, because of the Polish thing.
Polish thing.
Oh my goodness.
I always remember that. He didn't know me from Adam. This is the first time I'd ever seen him.
Oh
but
my
he saw
goodness.
Savannah, and he says, Pulaski.
That is amazing. Oh my goodness. Now, how long before he passed away did you have that lunch with him?
Oh, there must have been, I'm a bishop 16 years. If that happened 3 years, so take off, that's 13, and he's dead 3 years. So that's about 10 years ago, yeah.
So when he died, it was just a tragedy. And it's such an interesting thing because, you know, the Pope is dead, long live the Pope, the new Pope comes, and that's a joyful thing,
Right.
but it's so sad. So how, I mean, he's just beloved.
Right. John Paul the Great. I'll make this observation because I watched an awful lot of it on television from the time that he died, his funeral, which was drama itself, you know. Every statesman of the world was at his funeral, you know, significant statesmen. They were all there, bunched together, you know, the high and the mighty of the political world. And there he is lying on the pavement, basically, of the Vatican, you know, in a wooden casket, which of course is going to be encased in marble or something. But from the time of his death, and at the funeral there's something like 2 million people. The city of Rome is closed down because they came from all over Europe especially. And they log-jammed. Well, but the Italians love that. This is what happens when the Pope dies, but especially John Paul II. Even though he's not an Italian, remember he's
Polish.
he's Polish.
But I would say that from his death, then his funeral, and then the installation within 10 days of Benedict XVI, I figured this is the church at its very best. How the mission continues, how the apostolic tradition continues. John Paul II, beloved, 22 years as Pope or something, I forget, it's something phenomenal. Traveled the world. I was at many of his World Youth Days, where he could sit up there in his chair like this with his walking stick and cajole 100,000 kids in the palm of his hand. Like the charism he had, the power he had. And even in his dying, I don't know if you ever saw that, where they brought him to the window to try and give a blessing about the day before he died, and he couldn't say the words, you know, and they just took him away from the open window, you know, because it was thousands literally praying for him, praying as he was dying, you know, and so then the election of John Paul, of Benedict XVI, you know, was controversial. A lot of people didn't like him because they figured he was very, very conservative and rigid and learned. He was an academic. He's not that John Paul II was not a great philosopher, but Benedict XVI, it's a strange thing to say, I can read his writings and exhortations easier than I can John Paul II's. He's just got a verve to him and an insight. So he's going to be a great Pope also, but in a different way, you know. And as we speak, he's getting ready to go to Madrid for World Youth Day. So the World Youth Day was inaugurated by John Paul II. He was the one who brought that into being. And the marvel of it is, he was, by his own personality, he forced us all to have a better appreciation of young people and how they must be nourished in the faith because of what he did with basically hundreds of thousands of them at these World Youth Days. So much, I've during my time as a bishop, I went to Toronto, I went to Colorado, I went to Sydney, Australia.
For the World Youth Day?
And I went to Germany. And because I found them in all of them, we had a group from our diocese there, small groups, 40 or 50 there. You know, but for them to identify with that scene of people from all over the world, which is another sign of what I call the church, you know, the community of faith, at prayer and at play and having a good time and being joyous in the Lord. You know?
Yeah, it's good that we have so much fun.
That's right. Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah.
We need to.
Yeah.
So, well, I think that we are out of time today.
Okay.
I'm sorry.